You think it's just a poem, just words. But the moment he pressed play on that Rumi video, reality cracked. Time froze. His reflection stopped mirroring him. And what he thought was a simple quote turned into a doorway, one that would force him to confront the one person he'd been running from his entire life, himself. Idris was a man of precision. Every aspect of his life followed a tight, silent rhythm. Wake up at 6:30. Brew 1 cup of coffee. Leave the apartment by 7:15. Walk the exact route to his office. The streets he passed, the faces he saw, even the cracks in the sidewalk were so familiar they might as well have been etched into his skin. He had lived this way for years, never questioning the pattern. It brought a certain comfort, a sense of control in a world that never stopped spinning. But something inside him, something faint like a whisper under layers of static, had begun to stir. He didn't notice it until the morning he stumbled across a video with a strange title, "Listen to Rumi, it will change your life forever." He clicked on it without thinking. Maybe out of boredom. Maybe that whisper had finally become too loud to ignore. Whatever the reason, the screen faded to black, and a voice, calm, ancient, and slow, began to speak. The words were not ordinary. They didn't inform or entertain. They reached. Idris felt them move through his chest like wind through hollow wood. He stood still in his living room, coffee forgotten on the table, phone in hand. And then something impossible happened. The clock on the wall slowed down. Not metaphorically. Literally. The second hand jerked, struggled, then stopped completely. The hum of the refrigerator faded. The sound of cars outside vanished. He looked out the window. A bird hung in the air, wings frozen mid-flap. On the street, a man was caught mid-stride, coffee cup in hand, eyes wide open but unmoving. The world had stopped, but Idris hadn't. His heart beat wildly in his chest. The video continued to play, Rumi's verses flowing like a stream into a silent canyon. Don't get lost in your pain, know that one day your pain will become your cure. The words weren't advice. They were memories. Scenes from Idris's life began to project around him, like holograms only he could see. He watched his younger self sitting alone at lunch in school. He saw himself at 20 saying no to an opportunity he was too afraid to take. He saw a version of himself in love, then another walking away from it. Each image carved into him with the sharpness of regret. He tried to close his eyes, but they wouldn't obey. It was as if the voice had taken control of his senses. He was being pulled inward, not outward. Everything he had avoided, every feeling he had buried under schedules and tasks, returned with brutal honesty. It was overwhelming, but also freeing. For the first time in years, he wasn't drifting. He was facing, and just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The clock ticked forward. The bird outside flew again. The city noise returned. Idris looked down at his phone. The video had ended. Only a black screen remained. But the silence inside him was louder than ever. He had changed, and something he couldn't explain what was watching. The apartment felt colder than before. Not in temperature, but in presence. Idris stepped inside, and the air seemed heavier, like it was holding something unseen. He hadn't slept since the video. He didn't feel tired. Instead, he felt as if a door had been cracked open in his mind, one that couldn't be shut again. The world outside had returned to its usual rhythm, but his inner world had shifted beyond recognition. There was an edge to everything now, a faint hum in silence, a weight in stillness. Every ordinary object seemed to hold a secret. He caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror and stopped. Something wasn't right. His reflection looked normal, but it didn't move when he did. He tilted his head slightly. Nothing. He lifted his arm. The reflection stared straight ahead, untouched by his movement. It wasn't mimicking, it was watching. A prickling sensation crept up his spine, not fear exactly, but a deep discomfort that touched something ancient and buried. He stepped closer. The surface of the mirror shimmered just slightly, as if the glass was no longer solid. Then came the whispers, not loud, barely audible, like wind brushing over dry leaves, but made of words. They weren't coming from the room. They came from the mirror. He leaned in, squinting. Letters began to form on the surface, not written by hand but emerging like breath on cold glass. The words pulsed softly, as if alive. "You've seen the world outside. Now see the world inside." Suddenly, his reflection changed. It was no longer the man he was now, it was him as a child, maybe 7 years old. The boy stared at him with wide, tearful eyes. Not frightened, not angry, just forgotten. Idris felt a deep ache open in his chest. He hadn't thought about that version of himself in years. That boy who used to stare out of windows and ask impossible questions. That boy who believed in magic and cried when birds flew away too fast. Somewhere along the way, Idris had buried him, convinced he had to grow up and let go of wonder. Now, the mirror was asking him to remember. The child raised a hand and touched the glass from the other side. Without thinking, Idris mirrored the gesture. As their fingertips aligned, a sudden chill shot through his body. The mirror fogged up completely, and when it cleared, the child was gone. In his place, a new message had appeared, glowing faintly like a dying ember. "Don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form." The words echoed in his mind like a bell struck underwater. Idris reached out. The moment his fingers touched the glass, it shattered, not with a crash, but with silence. Pieces floated briefly in midair before dissolving into dust. Behind the frame, tucked into a hidden ledge, lay a small iron key. Cold to the touch. Ancient, though it bore no rust. He didn't know what the key opened, but he knew with certainty it was meant for him, and it had been waiting a long time. The key sat on his palm like it had weight beyond metal. It was old, its edges worn smooth, its teeth jagged and strange, unlike any modern key Idris had seen. He didn't question how it had ended up behind the mirror. He didn't try to rationalize the whispers or the reflection of his younger self. That part of him, the one that needed answers, had gone quiet. Something else had taken over. A deeper part, more instinct than thought, was now guiding him. And that part knew one thing for certain: the key had a destination. He left the apartment without knowing where he was going. The morning air pressed against his face, crisp but distant, like the world was moving through him rather than around him. His feet carried him through familiar streets, past shops and strangers, but none of it registered. He didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. It was as if the key in his pocket was pulling him forward, like a magnet drawn to something hidden. The city around him began to change. The clean sidewalks gave way to cracked pavement. The buildings grew older, some abandoned entirely. Windows boarded up, paint peeled. Streetlights buzzed dimly above. Few people walked this part of town anymore. It was the kind of place that had slipped through time, forgotten by progress. Idris walked deeper into it, past alleyways and rusted fences, until he reached a dead end. But it wasn't empty. At first glance, it looked like nothing: a wall overgrown with ivy, trash bins toppled nearby, graffiti scrawled across the bricks. But then he saw it. Hidden beneath a tangle of vines was a door. A wooden door, freestanding, not connected to any building or frame. It stood upright on its own, defying logic. Idris stepped closer. The wood was weathered, split with age, yet the handle gleamed as if polished daily. There was a small, circular hole above the knob, just the size and shape for the key in his pocket. He hesitated, but only for a breath. The key slid in smoothly and turned with a deep, resonant click. The door creaked open, revealing only darkness. Not the kind of darkness found in basements or empty rooms. This was different. It felt thick, like mist you couldn't see through but could feel on your skin. It had depth. Idris stepped inside, and the door closed behind him without a sound. There were no walls, no ceiling, just blackness stretching in every direction, yet his footsteps echoed as if on stone. He walked slowly, uncertain, until something appeared in the distance, a faint glow flickering like candlelight. As he approached, he saw words spinning in the air, suspended in a slow, circular dance. Rumi's verses. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, glowing in gold light and moving like fireflies. They began to orbit him, circling faster with each step. The air buzzed. The ground vibrated beneath him. And then the words whispered in unison. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Idris stood still. The circle of light closed in. There was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of silence. Not because the world had gone quiet, but because Idris no longer heard it the same way. The city buzzed, cars honked, people rushed from one place to another with urgency, but to him it all sounded muffled, like noise filtered through water. Something had shifted permanently. Since stepping through that door, he couldn't quite return to who he was. He moved through the world, but he was no longer part of its rhythm. Everything appeared familiar, yet nothing felt real. First, he thought it was just him, that maybe the experience had fractured his perception somehow. But then he noticed the shadows, not ordinary ones. These didn't follow the rules of light or form. They clung to people, not beneath their feet or behind them, but just behind their eyes. Invisible to the untrained eye, yet unmistakable once seen. The barista who smiled too quickly had a shadow coiled around her chest like smoke. The man on the subway who laughed loudly into his phone had a flickering darkness hovering behind his shoulders. Children had them too, though theirs were thinner, trembling like candle flames. They weren't ghosts. They weren't spirits. Idris didn't know exactly what they were, but he understood what they meant. These shadows were not external. They were grief, guilt, regret, loneliness. They were the pieces of people that had gone unspoken, unnoticed, and unhealed. Most walked through life unaware they carried them, but now Idris could see them clearly, and the truth was unbearable. Because his shadow was the largest of all, that he saw it one morning as he passed by a reflective storefront window. It hovered behind him like a second body, featureless but heavy, rippling gently with every step. It had grown over the years, fed by the decisions he avoided, the emotions he suppressed, the parts of himself he refused to face. It had no eyes, yet it watched him constantly. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his apartment in the dark, staring at the walls, listening to the silence grow louder. The verses he had heard inside the door began to echo again in his mind, and one line in particular refused to leave. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." He whispered it to himself again and again. First, nothing happened. But then he turned his attention inward, not in the way one remembers memories, but in the way one feels pain, directly without defense. He let the sorrow rise, the kind he had buried so deeply he forgot it had a shape. He let it swell, burn, and break. He didn't fight it this time. He simply witnessed. And slowly his shadow began to move. Not toward him, but into him. It didn't disappear. It became part of him. He wasn't healed. But he was no longer hiding. The world outside remained the same. But Idris wasn't. Idris stood on the rooftop as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The city below was slowly waking. Cars beginning to hum, windows lighting up, distant footsteps echoing across the streets. But none of it disturbed the stillness he felt inside. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing anywhere. He wasn't haunted by thoughts of what needed to be done, what had been missed, or what could go wrong. He simply stood, fully present, breathing in the quiet beauty of a world that never stopped turning. He had changed, not in a way that others might notice right away. He still looked the same, wore the same clothes, walked the same streets, but something fundamental inside him had shifted. It was as if someone had cleaned the glass he used to look through, revealing colors, patterns, and textures he had forgotten were there. But more than that, he had begun to see himself differently. Not as a collection of roles or achievements or failures, but as something vast and alive. Something still unfolding. The verses of Rumi played in his mind, not as memories, but as living truths. They surfaced without effort, like breath rising through still water. Each one struck him differently now. He no longer analyzed them or tried to make sense of them. He simply listened, and they spoke in ways that went beyond language. You were born with wings. Why prefer to crawl through life? He thought of all the years he spent crawling, chasing certainty, fearing failure, avoiding pain. He thought of the routines he clung to, the dreams he had silenced, the joy he had postponed for some later day that never came. And now, standing on the edge of a rooftop, he realized none of it had ever been necessary. The prison he once lived in had no walls. It had only ever existed in his mind. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. Inside, he felt an opening, not physical but unmistakable. A widening of space, as if the boundaries of his inner world were dissolving. It wasn't a vision or an epiphany. It was something quieter, deeper, a recognition. The sky he had always admired above him was now reflected within. Boundless, still, alive. The change hadn't come from watching a video. It hadn't come from a mirror, a key, or a mysterious door. Those were only invitations. What truly changed him was the choice to listen, to face what was hidden, to feel what hurt, to accept what was real. The verses of Rumi had not given him something new. They had returned him to what was already there. As the sun lifted higher and washed the buildings in gold, Idris smiled softly. He knew now that transformation was not a moment, that it was a path. And he had finally taken the first step, not toward something outside himself, but toward the sky that had always lived inside his soul.